Liam lived above a silent world where clouds moved slowly over cracked mountains and rivers of dust flowed like ghosts. He was not a soldier or a pilot or a hero. He was just an engineer who worked on machines that others forgot. His station floated between trade routes and broken satellites. Every morning started with metal and silence. Every night ended with empty food trays and flickering screens. No one called him and no one visited him. He had grown used to that life and told himself he liked it that way. The station lights were dim and the hum of old generators filled every corner. Liam spent his days in a repair bay, fixing cargo drones and worn-out scanners. He talked only to machines. They did not judge or laugh. They only beeped and waited. The only voice he heard often was from a broken assistant bot that always repeated the same words at shift change. Time moved without feeling. The stars outside never changed. Days blended together like oil in water. Then came the crash. He had been running a systems check on an old freighter when an alert blinked on his console. A small object was entering emergency orbit. Its path was unstable. He checked the readings. It was an alien pod and it was damaged. Liam watched it spin and slow and tumble across the sky. He waited for command instructions. None came. The main station above had no interest in tiny drifting objects. They were too busy guarding trade deals and patrol scans. So Liam went alone. He took his shuttle and followed the signal to a rocky landing field. The pod was half buried in ash and smoke curled from its broken side. He approached slowly. The outer shell was cracked and glowing from heat. He forced open the hatch and what he saw inside made him freeze. She was not human. Her skin was silver but soft like light in water. Her eyes were deep and glowing faint blue. She had arms and a face like his, but her body ended below the waist. She had no legs. Only smooth lines of healing skin and wires wrapped around her lower frame. She was breathing and conscious but weak. She looked at him and said one word in a soft electric voice. Through a translator Liam could have walked away. He could have called it in and let patrols take care of it. But he did not. He lifted her out of the wreck and carried her to his shuttle. Her body was light, but her presence felt heavy. She stared at him without fear. She did not ask questions. She did not explain where she came from or what had happened. She just closed her eyes and trusted him back at the station. He placed her in a med pod and checked her vital signs. Her species was unknown to him, but the scanner gave him enough to keep her stable. She slept for hours while he watched from the corner. He had never had anyone stay in his room before. Her breathing was slow and her skin glowed softly in the dark. He felt something strange, a feeling that had no name. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the beginning of something he did not understand. When she woke again, she asked why he had helped her. He had no answer. He just said it felt right. She nodded. She did not thank him in words. Instead, she tapped a small device on her wrist, and a soft light filled the room. Images floated in the air, a memory, her ship, a battle. Then silence. She had been left behind, not by accident. On purpose. Liam looked at her and felt a sharp ache in his chest. She had no legs and no one coming for her. He had no friends and no one waiting for him. And somehow in that quiet broken moment, they were not alone anymore. Station never felt this alive before, even though its walls remained cold and its halls still echoed with silence. Something had changed inside Liam, and he did not know how. To explain it, the girl now rested in his living space, her body supported by a soft energy cradle he had built from spare parts and unused tools that hovered just above the floor and followed his voice commands. She watched him move around the room, her glowing eyes tracing every step he took, and although she said little, her presence filled the space with something that felt close to warmth. He began to work on a new design, one that could give her more than just rest, a way for her to move freely around the station, not as a patient or a guest, but as someone who belonged there like him. He gathered parts from old cargo bots and scavenged modules from unused suits. He sketched and soldered and adjusted again and again while she watched. quietly sometimes, offering the sound of approval sometimes, showing him symbols through her translator light. She could not walk, but her mind moved. Faster knowledge of circuits and motion tech was advanced, and Liam found himself learning from her. Without even realizing it, as the days passed, their routine became something gentle. Liam would bring food, and she would observe his work. They would share quiet moments staring out of the window into the stars. Sometimes she would show him pieces of her past through light images floating in the air, stories of her planet, her people, and how she had trained to serve in missions that required silence and sacrifice. She had been skilled and respected, but when the accident happened and her legs were lost, her value was questioned. She was not broken, she said, only left behind, because she reminded them of what they feared most: failure. Liam listened and did not interrupt. He understood what it meant to be unwanted, not for what you did, but for who you were. He had worked in the colony's main tech station once, and had been pushed aside by louder voices and brighter titles. He had never failed, but he had never shown either, so they ignored him, and he had slowly disappeared from their minds until even he began to forget what it felt like to be seen now. As he tightened the final piece of her mobility base and activated the soft hum of its engine, he watched her rise from the cradle and hover gently above the floor. The device responded to her thoughts with ease, and she moved around the room slowly at first. Then, with growing confidence, her eyes widened with something close to joy, and for the first time, Liam saw her smile, not with lips or words, but with a light that pulsed softly across her skin. She floated toward him and reached out with her hand. He hesitated, then took it. Her fingers were cooler than human touch, but there was something steady and strong in them. She looked into his eyes and said through her soft translator voice, "This is the first time I have moved without pain since the fall," and he felt a quiet pride build inside him, not because he had built something new, but because she had trusted him enough to try. They began to share more after that. He showed her human music and the strange rhythms of old Earth. She showed him how her people used color to speak emotions: blue for peace, red for warning, green for joy, golden for connection. Their silent conversations grew longer, more comfortable. Sometimes Liam forgot she was alien, and sometimes she forgot she was broken. They would laugh softly, not loudly, but enough to fill the space with something that did not feel empty anymore. One night, as they sat by the large window that looked out into deep space, she asked him what he feared most. He looked at the stars and answered, being forgotten. She nodded slowly and replied, "I feared that too, but not anymore, not while I am here with you." And though neither of them said the words, that moment wrapped around them like a quiet promise. They did not know what waited beyond the station, or if her people would return, but they knew one thing for sure: they were no longer alone, and in a universe full of silence and loss they had found something worth holding on to. The silence around the station was no longer empty. It had begun to carry a kind of rhythm: the quiet hum of the power systems, the soft whisper of Aya's mobility base as she moved through the halls, the faint sound of Liam's tools clicking and whirring in the workshop. All of it created a calm that felt alive, something rare, something sacred. Liam found himself waking up before his alarm now, sometimes before the lights even turned on across the station. He would get up and check the systems, not because he had to, but because he wanted everything to run perfectly. He would prepare simple meals and wait for Aya to join him, her floating frame gliding softly across the floor, her eyes scanning the room and meeting his with that calm, steady glow. He never said it out loud, but her presence had become the best part of his day. They had started working together more closely, not just on small repairs, but on a secret project, one that would keep her safe if her people ever came back. Because even though days had passed without any signals, Liam had learned enough to know that nothing ever stayed quiet forever. He had accessed old records and found traces of a warning her people had sent before the crash. It spoke of danger, not just to her, but to anyone who harbored her. They had marked her as defective, a risk to their image of strength and order. They would return, not to rescue, but to erase. He told her everything slowly, carefully, without panic, but with honesty. She listened without blinking, then simply said, "We will need a plan." Her calmness gave him strength, and together they began to build something that could hide her from scans. A signal shield woven into the core of the station. Using pieces from broken drones and stealth systems, Liam had once studied and failed to understand, but now with her help, every piece began to make sense. Every wire had a purpose, every chip had a meaning in the quiet hours they tested the system. Again and again, Aya connected directly to the grid, her mind faster than any processor. She adjusted code while Liam handled the tools. They moved as one, without needing many words. There was a harmony between them built from trust and time and shared silence, but harmony cannot last forever. It began with a flicker in the outer sensors, just a pulse, then a wave, a pattern too exact to be natural. Liam checked and rechecked and confirmed it was a scan, narrow and focused, not from a nearby ship, but from far above, a long-range probe programmed to search and identify alien biosigns, one that belonged to Aya's people. It passed over once, then again, then paused and turned back. Aya stood behind him, watching the data, her eyes quiet, her face still. He turned to her and asked what would they do if they found her, and she answered without pause, "They would erase this place and everyone in it." Liam felt a cold shiver, but also something deeper rising inside him, not fear, but a fierce kind of purpose. He had been alone before, and it had never mattered. Now it did. They knew the probe would return, and this time with more precision. So they worked faster, adding deeper layers to the shield and preparing a false signal that would trick the scanners into believing Aya was drifting through space. Long gone, lost to time, they set up echo beacons across the system, redirecting energy signatures and adjusting power flows until the station looked like nothing more than a quiet, forgotten machine. During the final test, something unexpected happened. The lights across the control room dimmed, and a soft voice echoed through the walls, not Aya's, not Liam's, but a recording from the probe, a voice speaking in her language, slow and cold, declaring target located and warning nearby vessels to prepare for retrieval. Aya looked at Liam, and for the first time he saw something like fear in her eyes. Not for herself, but for him. She reached out and touched his hand, not for comfort, but as if asking permission to act, to disappear, to protect him. He shook his head and tightened his grip. Her safety was his choice now too, and he would not let her face this alone. Scan wave grew stronger. The station began to vibrate slightly, not from damage, but from energy pressure. Their window to act was shrinking. Liam activated the echo signal and watched as the false data burst outward, a perfect trail of decay, leading into the black, empty stretch of space where no one would search. Then the signal blinked and the probe shifted its course, slowly pulling away. The voice faded and the sensors cleared. For now they were safe. They did not cheer or speak. Instead, they sat beside each other, breathing slowly, eyes fixed on the stars outside, both knowing this was not the end of the danger, but it was proof that together they were not powerless. Inside the silence, their bond grew stronger, not because of what they had done, but because of what they were willing to do for each other. And in that moment, Liam realized that what he feared most was not being alone again, but losing the one being who had made him feel found. The station floated quietly through space, while far above and beyond its view, unseen networks moved faster than light, messages, warnings, silent commands, all moving between ships and systems hidden behind encrypted signals, none of them visible to Liam or Aya. But both of them knew what silence really meant. Now it was not peace. It was a waiting breath before the storm inside the station. Their work became more focused. Every step now carried urgency. Every hour was used for something important. Aya could no longer risk using her real identity. Her signals were scrubbed, and her body was hidden behind energy patterns designed to bend light and shadow. She was no longer a visitor or a guest. She had become a ghost in the system, seen only by Liam and trusted only by him. Liam spent long days inside the heart of the station, adjusting old power cores, redirecting current through buried wires, and bypassing control locks. He knew the station better than anyone, now even better than its original designers. He crawled through vents with tools in his teeth and sweat on his face while Aya stayed connected to the main console, watching everything, guiding him through dangers, warning him when sensors sparked or energy spikes grew too strong. She was the voice in his ear, the light in his screen, the steady pulse that kept him going. But while they worked, the colony below had begun to notice something. Strange supply delays, system errors, minor power shifts, all connected to Liam's sector. Someone had started asking questions. Requests came from command centers and satellite nodes. People wanting to know if his station was still functional, why readings had changed, and why no one had heard from the quiet engineer in over a month. Liam responded with simple reports, all true but carefully written, enough to pass inspections, but not enough to invite visits. Aya helped write them using neutral language and soft data that avoided attention. But the questions continued, and one message arrived with a code. Liam could not ignore it. It was from his old supervisor, a man who had once dismissed Liam without hesitation, now asking if everything was all right. The tone was polite, but the meaning was clear. They suspected something, and they were preparing to look closer. Aya and Liam met in the observation room, the stars behind them, and the station map glowing before them. She showed him the scan patterns and how soon a patrol ship would arrive, not one from her people, but from the colony itself. A standard visit meant to inspect and report, but if they found her, if they found the systems she had touched, the risk would grow too large. They would lose everything. They had two choices: run or hide. Both came with danger. Both required trust and sacrifice, and both needed something more than machines, something Liam had not used in a long time: his memory, his reputation, and the last remaining access codes to the colony tower, a place he had left in silence, a place where people still remembered his name but not his face. Aya looked at him and asked if he was ready. He did not speak for a long time. Instead, he stared at the map and then at her and finally nodded. He told her there was one way to protect them both, but it meant going back into a place that had once closed its doors to him. She said nothing, only moved closer and placed her hand on his arm, and in that silent touch, he found more support than 1,000 voices. They prepared quickly. The pod they would use was old and slow, but reliable. Aya reprogrammed its signature to appear as a delivery unit, while Liam loaded tools and data cores into hidden compartments. Their plan was to enter the colony as technicians running a security check, a routine task ignored by most, but if done right, it would allow them into the tower's core, where the master signals were stored, where they could rewrite her status, not just erase her from the threat list, but create a new identity, one that would shield her from every future scan. As they launched from the station, Liam kept his eyes forward, his hands steady. Aya sat beside him, connected to the pod's systems, feeding him routes and updates, both of them silent, both of them aware that failure meant more than capture. It meant separation, and they had grown beyond that. Now they were not just a human and an alien. They were a team shaped by survival, built on trust, powered by something unspoken. They entered the colony airspace without alarms. The docking port accepted their codes. The guards waved them through without pause, and for the first time in years, Liam stepped back into the world that had once pushed him out. Nothing had changed. The walls still smelled like metal and oil. The halls still echoed with voices that did not know his name, but this time he walked with purpose. This time, he was not alone. Aya stayed in the shadows, her presence hidden behind cloaking tech, while Liam moved from room to room, performing basic tasks and mapping their path. They had one shot to reach the tower core and insert the new data, a path that required speed, silence, and perfect timing. Failure would bring scanners, and scans would bring soldiers, and soldiers would bring the end. But neither of them spoke of failure. They moved forward because they had to, because together they had already done the impossible, and now they would do it again. The colony tower stood tall against the sky, a structure made of glass, metal, and silence, filled with voices that moved fast and eyes that never looked down. It had always felt cold to Liam when he had worked there years ago, full of people who typed orders and followed schedules, but never noticed the quiet ones, never saw those who made things work from the background. Now he was walking its halls again, but this time not as a shadow. This time he carried something more than tools. He carried a reason. Aya stayed hidden within the pod's core network, her mind linked to Liam's small earpiece, guiding him every step of the way as he passed scanners and checkpoints that once ignored him, but now watched more closely. Every door he opened brought him closer to the tower core, and every hallway behind him closed like a breath he could not take back. The air was sharp, and the lights above flickered in patterns he had almost forgotten, but he kept moving forward, not for himself but for her. The data room was quiet, with blinking consoles that hummed softly. Rows of storage nodes lined the walls like frozen memories waiting to be rewritten. He approached the central console and placed the chip Aya had designed onto the interface. The screen blinked, then shifted, showing lines of code and ID tags. Aya whispered through the earpiece, guiding his fingers across keys, unlocking layers of security, removing her classification from the threat database, replacing it with a new identity. Not a lie, but a version of her that no longer triggered the search commands of her people. Liam watched as red signals turned green and danger flags faded from the system logs. He saw the digital version of her name disappear from the blacklist and reappear on a list of independent travelers authorized for safe passage. It was not just erasure, it was rebirth. He leaned back slightly, his breath caught in his throat, not because of the work, but because he had never done something that mattered. This much before, but peace never comes without a cost. And outside the room, a silent alarm had been tripped, one that did not blink or shout, but sent a signal straight to command. Eyes began to turn, voices began to question, and the patrol teams started to move. Someone had noticed a ghost in the system, a name that should not have returned. Liam had minutes, maybe less, to finish and escape. He closed the terminal and moved fast through the hallways, his steps steady but quick, his heart beating louder. Then his thoughts. Aya guided him through side paths and maintenance ducts, shortcuts only someone like her could find. He moved past voices, past open doors, past curious glances, until he reached the docking bay, where their pod still waited, its engines warm, its signal silent. The door opened, and she was already there, waiting, her frame still hidden from view. Her presence felt more than seen. He stepped inside and took the pilot seat. Without a word, she linked into the system and launched the pod upward, away from the tower, away from the colony, away from the place that had once ignored him and had now tried to trap him again. As the stars returned around them, Liam leaned back and let his breath out slowly, his eyes finding hers across the dim space between them, her expression calm but her glow pulsing softly with something he had come to understand as joy, not loud, not shining, but real and alive. Traveled in silence for a long time, passing satellites and blinking stars, until the station finally appeared again in the distance, small, but waiting, like a memory they had left behind but never forgotten. They docked without trouble and re-entered the place that had become their home. The walls still looked the same, the lights still hummed, the tools still waited in the corner, but everything had changed. Aya hovered beside him as he walked through the corridors, her new ID active, her presence no longer hunted, her movements no longer hidden. She belonged now, not just here, but anywhere they chose to go. Liam opened the control panel and looked at the systems, then at her, and asked, "What comes next?" She tilted her head and replied softly, "We go forward." He nodded and began preparing the Explorer module, a long-range ship he had once kept for parts, now given purpose again. They packed supplies, recalibrated the engines, and set a course into uncharted space, a place where no one knew them and no one cared who they had been, only who they were now. Liam stood at the window, one last time looking at the stars, not as a lonely man, but as someone who had built something that mattered, someone who had found something more than survival. He had found meaning. Aya joined him, her floating form quiet beside his. They stood together in the glow of distant suns, two beings once broken, now whole, not because they were fixed, but because they had chosen each other. Engines powered up, the ship moved slowly away from the station, leaving behind the silence and the shadows, carrying with it a story not of war or glory, but of two souls who had nothing and still gave everything. Were not heroes, they were not legends, they were simply Liam and Aya, and that was more than enough. The end.